When my son asked me to sign one small paper, he said it would make life easier. I thought he meant mine. The morning light was soft, but something in their smiles felt sharp. I signed it anyway, the paper that turned my name into their property. They said it was love, just paperwork. But love shouldn't need legal permission. They believed I was too old to think. They forgot. I've spent my whole life reading between the lines. That morning the lake outside my window looked like glass. Quiet, still, unreadable. I brewed my tea the same way I did every day, 2 spoons of sugar 1 minute too long. The clock ticked softly in the kitchen. My house smelled like books and paper, like stories that had learned to stay silent. People used to come to me for answers. I was a librarian for 35 years. I knew where every book belonged. I knew how to help people find what they were missing. But when my husband died and the shelves at home began to outnumber the voices, I realized there are no catalogs for loneliness. I started writing again. In a small leather journal I called the Pages of Memory, I wrote about the books I loved and the days I wanted to remember. Sometimes I wrote just to prove I still could. Books never betrayed me. People did. Peter, my son, called every Sunday. He always sounded rushed. His company had failed and he talked about starting fresh. He said the economy was cruel to men his age. I listened because mothers don't interrupt their children's hope. Then came Hannah. Polite, smart, the kind of woman who knows how to make a sentence sound like a compliment and a warning at once. She worked at a bank and she smiled with her eyes before she spoke. I wanted to believe she loved my son for who he was, not for who he wanted to be again. One evening over dinner she said gently, "Mom, maybe you shouldn't handle all these bills by yourself anymore. Peter could take care of it for you. It would make life easier." Easier. Such a beautiful word. I didn't realize then how heavy it could become. I looked at my son. He nodded, almost relieved. I thought he was finally learning responsibility. I thought this was what love looked like, help offered without being asked. That night I wrote in my journal, "Love often dresses up as protection, but sometimes protection is just a softer word for control." In psychology they call it the balance of power, the invisible line between caring and owning. When affection carries money in its pocket, it stops being pure, turns into a kind of quiet authority. One person feels needed. The other starts to forget how to stand on their own. I didn't know it yet, but I was already crossing that line. By saying yes to their help, I was handing them more than the bills. I was handing them my trust. And trust, once signed away, is the hardest thing to borrow back. That night I made tea again. The steam fogged the window, blurring the view of the lake. I wrote one last sentence before turning off the light. When love needs paperwork, something sacred has already been lost. It started small. A few bills on the counter, a few "let me handle it for you, Mom." Peter said it with care in his voice, the way sons do when they want to sound responsible. I let him. After all, I had raised him to take charge. A month later, I noticed the envelopes stopped coming. The mailbox was still full, but not with my name. Peter said he was moving all the payments online. "Just so you don't have to deal with it, Mom." He smiled like it was a gift. Then one morning my bank card didn't work. The screen flashed. "Account locked. Contact administrator." Administrator. I didn't know I needed one. When I called Peter, he said, "It's safer this way. I don't want you to make a mistake with transfers." He used the word protect. People always do when they're about to take something. I gave them comfort. They gave me silence. The house grew quieter each week. They came by less often, except to pick up mail or packages with their names on them. My kitchen smelled different now. Hannah's perfume, lemon, and control. Even the chairs seemed to have new rules I hadn't been told about. Once I asked for the folder with my property documents. Hannah was sorting papers in the living room. She looked up and smiled, soft, polished, deliberate. "Mom, you don't need to worry about all that. Peter and I have it under control." Her voice was kind, but her eyes said, You've been dismissed. That night, I walked through my own home like a guest, trying not to touch anything. I opened the drawer where my checkbook used to be, empty. The small notebook where I tracked my expenses, gone. I found it later in Peter's desk drawer, folded neatly, like evidence handled with care. I sat by the window and watched the lake disappear into the fog. I wondered when care had turned into custody, when love had started keeping receipts. I wanted to call someone, anyone. But who do you call when it's your own child holding the keys? I made tea instead. The cup rattled against the saucer. I stared at my reflection in the window and whispered, I used to be the one who helped everyone organize their lives. Now mine is organized for me. I tried to convince myself it was temporary, that this was what love looked like at 70. But deep down I knew, something was shifting. Every decision they made for me came wrapped in tenderness, sealed with silence. And silence, I was learning, is the softest kind of control. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. The plain white envelope, nothing special. The kind of letter that looks harmless until you open it. Inside was a document stamped with the hospital's logo. The valuation summary. Cognitive decline, Margery Collins. My name was written in blue ink, and underneath it my signature. Except it wasn't mine. For a moment I just stared at it. The letters blurred, but not because of my eyes. Because something inside me broke, quietly like glass under a rug. They didn't steal my money. They stole my right to choose. I called Peter. It rang 5 times before he answered. He sounded distracted, almost annoyed. Mom, I'm in a meeting. What's wrong? I told him about the letter. He paused too long. Then he said, it's probably just a formality. Don't overthink it. And before I could ask anything else, the line went dead. A few minutes later, Hannah called. Her voice was soft, the kind that sounds like comfort if you don't listen too closely. Oh, Margery, she said, it's just paperwork. You don't need to worry about those things. We're handling it. Her words were sugar. Her tone was iron. I sat at the kitchen table. The letter spread open like a confession I never wrote. Outside, the lake was perfectly still, mocking how easily things can look peaceful while they're drowning you. I used to think betrayal came with shouting, slammed doors, angry faces. But this was betrayal with a pen. That night I took out the pages of memory. The notebook still smelled faintly of old paper and tea. I wrote at the top of a fresh page. Today I learned that silence has a signature. I copied every word from the letter, every line, every date. Then I underlined the fake signature. 3 times. I started adding details. The time Peter called last. The way Hannah always said we instead of you. The missing mail, the closed accounts, the new passwords I never created. I didn't know what I would do with all of it yet. But writing made me feel human again. It reminded me that I still knew the difference between truth and forgery. By midnight, my hand hurt from holding the pen. I looked at the ink stains on my fingers and smiled a little. At least these marks were mine. Before going to bed, I tore the hospital letter in half. Then I placed both pieces inside the journal, between the pages labeled January. If they were going to write my story without asking me, I would make sure my version was already on record. That night I didn't pray for justice. I just whispered to myself, remember this, Margery. Remember everything. In psychology they call it financial enabling. When parents buy love through dependence. I didn't read that in a book. I lived it. For years I believed generosity was proof of love. I paid Peter's student loans. I helped them with the down payment. When the car broke down, I covered the repairs. When their credit cards maxed out, I sent a check before they even asked. First they said thank you. Then they stopped saying anything at all. I told myself I was helping. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We fix things. We fill the gaps. Even when the gaps were made by the same hands we're feeding. One night, I opened my old ledger. The one I used to track grocery bills and library donations. Page after page I saw my own handwriting. $1,200 for rent. $450 for car insurance. The lake shimmered, and for the first time in months I didn't feel invisible. Before leaving, she placed her hand on mine. "You don't need to shout to be heard," she said. "Just make sure what you write can't be forgotten." After she left, I sat there holding the notebook. I ran my fingers over the pages and thought about everything I hadn't said. Every thank you that went unanswered. Every "Mom, don't worry" that really meant "Mom, don't ask." That night, I placed the notebook beside the pages of memory. 2 books, 2 lives. One that they controlled, one that I would reclaim. As the house settled into its usual quiet, I wrote my first line. I gave away comfort and received silence. Now I give my silence shape. The pen didn't tremble this time, and neither did I. I wrote every morning, not out of habit but survival. The notebook Mrs. Whitaker gave me sat by the window, the cover soft from use. Each page began the same way. The date, the weather, and a quote from a book I loved. It made the writing feel less lonely, like I had company from wiser minds. That first week I wrote under the title Jane Eyre. "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," to became my prayer. The quiet rebellion hidden between lines of ink. At first my notes seemed ordinary, shopping lists, library recommendations, thoughts about the lake. But inside every paragraph I left codes only I could read. A mention of The Great Gatsby meant a withdrawal Hannah made without my consent. Little Women marked the day Peter changed my medical contacts. Every book title was a witness. They thought the pages were nostalgia, but they were evidence. Some nights when the house was silent, I'd reopen my old ledgers, comparing handwriting, noting the dates. Their control was methodical, so my resistance had to be, too. I stopped crying over the letters from the hospital. Instead, I started cataloging them, folding each one carefully, labeling them like I used to file books at the library. Control through order, justice through detail. I filled a whole section of the notebook called Margery's Observations. Each intro began with the simple phrase, "Today I noticed." Today I noticed my voice being talked over. Today I noticed my mail arriving already opened. Today I noticed I still remembered every word they said. The power wasn't in the ink. It was in the clarity that came with writing it down. Every page became a mirror. And in that reflection I didn't see a weak, aging woman. I saw a librarian rebuilding her own archive, one truth at a time. When I read the entries back, I heard something new in my own voice. It wasn't trembling anymore. It was measured, deliberate, like someone preparing to teach a lesson. I ended each night by underlining the same sentence. "They will forget what they said, but I will remember what they did." Even caged minds find a way to think. That line stayed with me. And slowly I began to believe that thought, when written, could be louder than any voice trying to silence it. The notebook was no longer just paper. It was the one place left where I was still free. That morning, Hannah arrived with a man in a navy suit. She didn't knock. She just smiled, the kind that hides something behind perfect teeth. "Mom," she said softly, "this is Mr. Reynolds, our attorney. He's just here to help us with a few updates." I didn't answer right away. They had stopped asking for permission a long time ago. Now they came only to announce decisions already made. The lawyer spread out papers on my dining table. "The new forms," he explained, "make things easier in case of emergencies." His tone was polite, practiced, the kind people use when they've done this many times before. Hannah placed a pen in my hand. Her nails were perfectly done. No hesitation, no warmth. "Just sign here, Mom. It's nothing complicated." I looked down at the stack. Every page full of legal words that sounded harmless but felt heavy. I smiled steady. "Would you mind if I used my own pen?" She laughed. "Of course not." I reached for the thin silver pen Mrs. Whitaker had given me, the one with light ink. It wrote softly, barely visible. Perfect for what I needed. I pretended to read, nodded in all the right places, and signed each line with a slow, shaking hand. Hannah exhaled, relieved. That's it. See? So easy. Her voice carried the sweetness of victory. When they left, I stood at the window until their car disappeared down the road. Then I sat back at the table, the papers still warm under my fingers. The ink shimmered faintly, pale as a ghost. I held one page to the light. The title appeared in bold, Declaration of Cognitive Incompetence. For a moment I couldn't breathe. They hadn't come to update anything. They had come to erase me, on paper in daylight with witnesses. I whispered the words out loud, testing them. Incompetent. I had shelved books, raised a child, built a life. And now one signature could undo it all. But what they didn't know was that my handwriting told stories. And the faint ink, they'd never see what I'd truly signed. I folded the document, placed it in an envelope, and wrote the date in the corner. Then I opened the pages of memory and wrote, "Today they tried to bury me under good manners. But daylight reveals everything, even lies dressed in politeness." I placed the two books side by side, Truth and Deception. The sun hit the edge of the table, catching the pale blue ink. It glowed like a whisper refusing to fade. They planned to erase me in daylight. They forgot who taught them to read the fine print. The next morning, I walked to Mrs. Whitaker's house with the notebook pressed to my chest. The air smelled like rain and old pine. I didn't feel afraid anymore, just tired of being silent. She opened the door before I could knock. "I knew you'd come," she said. I handed her the notebook. She flipped through the pages slowly, her eyes sharp and steady. When she reached the page marked Echoes of Control, she closed it and said, "This isn't just a diary, Margery. It's a record." Her living room still looked like a courtroom that had forgotten its gavel. Books of law stacked to the ceiling, dust caught in the morning light. She picked up the phone and dialed a number written on an old envelope. "We're going to see Nathan Hale," she said. "He handles elder abuse cases." That afternoon, we sat across from him in a narrow office above a bakery. He was younger than I expected, with a calm face and a voice that didn't rush. He read through my notes page by page, lips tightening at the signatures, the dates, the forged forms. Finally, he set the notebook down. "This is not just neglect," he said. "This is theft of identity." I looked at him and felt something shift inside me. Something that had been asleep for too long. My hands were still trembling, but my voice wasn't. "Then I'll use the only weapon they gave me," I said. "My words." Mrs. Whitaker smiled, that small proud smile of someone who just watched a door open. Nathan leaned forward. "Margery, do you understand what this means? They'll fight back. People like this always do." "I know," I said. "They taught me how." He nodded. "We'll start by filing a motion. I'll need your statement, your medical history, and every document they made you sign." "I kept everything," I said. "Even the lies." We spent hours building the case. I showed him the faint signatures, the receipts, the coded diary entries. Each page turned into a piece of truth, quiet but undeniable. By the time we finished, daylight had faded, and the bakery below had closed. Nathan closed the folder gently. "You know," he said, "most people your age give up. They think silence is peace." I looked out the window at the dark street. "Silence is surrender," I said. "And I'm not done being myself." When I left his office, the rain had started again. Steady, deliberate, almost like applause. For the first time in months, I didn't feel erased. I felt rewritten. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper. I sat on the left side, between Nathan and Mrs. Whitaker. Across from me, Hannah adjusted her blazer and whispered to Peter. He didn't look at me. Not once. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The sound of chairs scraping the floor echoed like a warning. When it began, Hannah's lawyer spoke first. "Your Honor, this is not a matter of greed. It's concern. Mrs. Gray has shown clear signs of cognitive decline. We're only trying to protect her." The words slid across the room, smooth and sharp. Protect. That's what they called it when they took everything. I watched Hannah nod along, her eyes full of practiced sadness. She said all the right things. Forgetfulness, confusion, mismanaged bills. The perfect portrait of a mother losing her grip on reality. And I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, because silence when used right can be louder than any voice. Nathan leaned toward me. "Your turn will come," he whispered. I nodded. My hands rested on the pages of memory. I could feel the weight of every word I'd written pressing against my palms. When Hannah took the stand, she smiled at the jury like a woman who believed the story she'd built. "She once forgot her own birthday," she said. "She sent me the same check twice last month." She looked down, pretending to choke up. "I love her, but love can't fix everything." Love. The most dangerous word when used by people who only want control. The lawyer asked for the declaration, the same paper I had signed with fading ink. He held it up as proof. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes met mine across the table. We both knew what it really said. The judge asked if I wanted to speak. I shook my head. Not yet. I let them continue. Every accusation, every polite insult disguised as concern. It was like watching a play about someone else, someone I used to be. Inside, my thoughts were steady. Let them finish their script, I told myself. Then I'll start mine. The lawyer ended with a phrase that almost made me laugh. Sometimes taking power away from someone is the kindest thing you can do. Kindness. Another lie wrapped in good manners. When the judge called for recess, I opened my notebook and began to write. Day 142, they spoke as if I wasn't there. But I was writing every word. I looked around the room, the jury, the lawyers, the family who thought I'd forgotten who I was. They didn't realize yet. I had spent my life keeping records. And now every line, every date, every so-called act of kindness had a witness. The court wasn't just their stage anymore. It was mine. When the judge called my name, the room fell silent. I stood slowly, the way you do when you know the moment has already changed you. Nathan nodded. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes were steady. I carried the pages of memory to the front, its spine worn, its corners soft from being opened too many times. My voice didn't shake. Entry July 8th, I began. They spoke kindly while erasing me. I looked at the faces in front of me, lawyers, the judge, the woman who once called me mom. They said it was love. They said it was protection. But protection should never require silence. The judge motioned for me to continue. So I opened the book. Each page was a piece of truth. January 5th. Hannah changed my mailing address. March 2nd. Peter closed my account without consent. April 11th, they asked me to sign a blank page. I read slowly, like a librarian returning borrowed words to the right shelves. The courtroom grew still. Even the air stopped moving. When I reached the section marked Echoes of Control, the judge took the notebook from my hands. He turned the pages himself. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He read in silence, the paper rustling like a confession. No one spoke. Not the lawyers, not the spectators. Even Hannah stayed frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Then the judge read out loud just one line. Every signature they took was a piece of my voice. But words can be signed back. He looked at me. Mrs. Gray, did you write all of this yourself? They lost the case. But I lost something too, my illusion. The one that said love alone could keep people honest. For a long time I believed forgiveness had to be earned. Now I understand it's something you give yourself when the fighting is over. I watched the pages drift across the lake, words dissolving into distance. Each one carried a piece of anger I no longer wanted to hold. Letting them go didn't feel weak. It felt necessary. People think forgiveness means approval. Doesn't. It means freedom from the noise, from the past, from the versions of yourself that kept waiting for an apology. I opened the last clean page of the pages of memory. The paper trembled slightly under my hand. I wrote slowly, the way one ends a chapter, not a life. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's how I stop them from living in my head. When I finished, I closed the notebook and pressed my palm against the cover. The ink was still warm. felt alive like a pulse. I thought about Peter, about Hannah, about how love sometimes breaks not from cruelty, but from misunderstanding that grows too deep to fix. The lake shimmered under the pale light. In its reflection, I didn't see an old woman who lost everything. I saw someone who finally understood the cost of peace, and chose to pay it. That night, I locked the notebook in a drawer. Not to hide it, but to rest it. Some stories don't need to be reopened. They've already taught what they were meant to teach. I poured a cup of tea, listened to the wind against the windows, and whispered to the silence. Let them live their story. I'll keep mine. And for the first time in years, the house felt quiet. Not empty, just forgiven. That night, the house was quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty. I sat by the lamp, pen in hand, and pulled out a piece of paper. It had been years since I'd written to Peter. Not an email, not a text, a real letter with ink that remembers. I started simply, "Dear Peter." Then the words began to pour out. I thought giving would teach love. I only taught you to take. I stopped for a moment. The sentence looked colder on paper than it had sounded in my heart. But truth often does. I told him about the nights I stayed awake, wondering where I went wrong, about how I used to think love meant never saying no, and how silence once meant to keep peace. Only taught him that I didn't matter. I wrote, "You took my trust, but I gave it freely. You took my money, but I gave that too. What hurt me most wasn't what you took. It was how little you thought it cost me." The clock ticked past midnight. Outside, the lake was dark, a mirror with no reflection. I kept writing anyway. "There's no court that can order forgiveness, Peter. You can only give it when you decide to stop waiting for an apology." I paused again. The ink had dried, but the ache behind each line was still wet. I folded the letter once, then twice. The paper made that soft, tired sound that only old letters make, the sound of something finished. I didn't write his address, didn't reach for an envelope. Some words aren't meant to travel. They just need to leave your chest so you can breathe again. I placed the letter in my drawer, between the old photos and the faded library card with my name on it. For years, I was the woman who recorded everything. Now I was the woman who could finally stop. "Some stories end with justice," I wrote in the corner of the page. "Mine ends with peace." I turned off the lamp. The room went dark, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt honest. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Soft, forgiving, and utterly silent. The morning I left, the town was still asleep. No one waved. No one needed to. Some goodbyes don't belong to words. I locked the door one last time and placed the key under the mat. It wasn't for anyone to find. It was for me to let go. The bus arrived late, humming like an old friend. I climbed aboard, holding the same notebook that had once saved me. Its pages were worn, corners bent, edges soft from all the times I turned them over in doubt. I took the window seat, the one that faced the lake. The water glimmered faintly in the distance, quiet as ever. For years, that lake had listened when no one else did. The driver asked, "Heading far?" I smiled. "Just forward." As the engine started, I looked down at the notebook in my lap. The single page had slipped loose, fluttering in the breeze like it wanted to escape. I caught it gently and read the last words I wrote. "I'm not leaving my past. I'm taking back my story." The sentence felt heavier than it looked, because for the first time it wasn't about running away. It was about walking toward something that belonged to me, my own voice. The bus turned past the old library. The building was closed, but I could still picture myself inside. Younger, certain, surrounded by shelves that never judged or asked too much. Books never needed forgiveness. People did. I rested my head against the window and watched the trees bend in the wind. The world outside moved fast, but my thoughts stayed calm. Maybe that's what peace is. Not the absence of memory, but the absence of noise. When we reached the bridge, I opened the notebook again. The last page fluttered, the ink barely dry. It read, The right to think, the last freedom we must never sign away. I traced the words with my finger. The soft gust of wind lifted the edge, then settled it back down. It felt like the world agreeing in silence. I closed the book, pressed it to my chest and whispered, "Thank you for keeping me company." As the town disappeared behind the fog, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything unfinished. Every chapter had found its ending, even the painful ones. I wasn't the same woman who once begged to be heard. I was the woman who learned to listen to herself. The bus kept moving north, the morning light spreading across the glass like a promise. I didn't look back again. Some stories don't need witnesses to be real. They just need a quiet departure and the courage to begin again. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full of things we never said, calls we never made, moments we thought we'd always have time for. If you still have a mother who remembers your stories, call her today. Not tomorrow. Not when the noise dies down. Today. Because one day the phone will stop ringing. And the voice that used to say your name, softly, patiently, will fade into the kind of quiet that never answers back. Don't wait until her words become silence. Tell her about your day. Ask her about hers. Let her talk about the same story for the 10th time. You'll miss that one day, the sound of someone who still cares enough to repeat herself. Mothers don't stay forever. Their stories do. And when they're gone, you'll wish you had listened just a little longer. So call her. Visit her. Let her know she's still part of your story. Because love isn't proven in grand gestures. It's whispered through small, ordinary moments. The kind we only recognize when they're gone. If you're lucky enough to still hear her voice, don't wait for the silence to remind you what it meant. Call her. While she still remembers your name. While her stories still remember you. They called it senility. I call it selective wisdom. The quiet art of remembering what matters, and forgetting who doesn't. People fear age because they think it steals something. But sometimes age is the only thing that gives it back: clarity, patience, perspective. It's strange how much peace comes when you stop needing to win every argument, or to be right in the eyes of those who never tried to understand you. For most of my life, I thought intelligence meant knowing everything. Now I know it means knowing what to let go of. The names. The dates. The pain that once felt permanent. We don't forget because we're weak. We forget because peace takes space. The older I get, the more I realize wisdom isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or prove itself in noise. It sits quietly in a chair by the window, watching the light change, grateful just to still see it. People used to say I was losing my mind. Maybe I was just making room in it. Room for gentler thoughts, for smaller joys. For the kind of truth that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. We spend our lives chasing justice, but justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Through the small acts that go unseen. Through the courage it takes to stand alone, to forgive, to remember ourselves when the world forgets. Maybe that's what legacy really is, not what we leave behind, but what we choose to keep alive. A voice, a page, the thought that refuses to fade. The story that continues in silence, long after the sound is gone. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers.